The untold dark secrets behind America's richest mansions behind the gilded gates of Newport, Rhode Island. A mansion the size of a city block sits empty most of the year. 70 rooms, marble imported from Italy. Gold leaf that cost more than most Americans will earn in a lifetime. But walk through the servants' quarters and you'll find something the tour guides rarely mention: locks on the outside of the doors. This is the untold story of America's richest mansions. A story about how the families who built industrial empires also built palaces where beauty masked brutality, where elegance hid exploitation, and where the people who made luxury possible were treated as less than human. In these houses, everything looked perfect from the outside. Perfect facades, perfect parties, perfect families photographed for society pages. But in the basements, in the attics, in the narrow corridors hidden behind false walls, another reality existed. Servants who slept 4 to a room, workers poisoned by the materials they installed, immigrants locked inside to prevent escape, children who grew up knowing that one mistake, one complaint, one moment of visibility could cost their entire family everything. Some of these estates still stand as museums, their crimes carefully edited from the narrative. Others have been demolished, their secrets buried under parking lots and condominiums. But the stories remain, stories whispered by descendants. Stories hidden in archives that nobody thought to check. Stories that reveal what it really cost to build the American dream for a few dozen families. What you're about to hear will change how you see every historical mansion, every preserved estate, every American castle that claims to tell the story of our nation's past. Because the real story isn't in the ballrooms. It's in the places visitors aren't allowed to see. If you want to understand the true price of American wealth, stay with me. This investigation took 3 years, hundreds of interviews, and access to documents that were never meant to be public. By the end, you'll never look at these mansions the same way again. The first time Maria saw the breakers, she thought it was a church. She was 14 years old, fresh off a ship from Italy, speaking perhaps 20 words of English, and standing in front of the largest private home she had ever imagined. 70 rooms, 13 bathrooms. A dining room that could seat 34 guests beneath ceilings covered in platinum leaf. Maria was not there as a guest. The year was 1895. The Vanderbilt family had just completed their summer cottage in Newport. The word cottage was a joke the wealthy told themselves, a way to pretend that spending $5 million, equivalent to roughly $150 million today, on a seasonal residence was somehow modest. Cornelius Vanderbilt II wanted a house that would eclipse everything his relatives had built. His wife Alice wanted a palace that would make European aristocracy feel inadequate. What they got was a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace perched on 13 acres of cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who gave America its taste for excess. The public rooms were designed to stun. The Great Hall rose 2 stories, walled in limestone and illuminated by crystal chandeliers that required 6 men to clean. The music room featured walls of platinum leaf. The morning room was decorated with painted panels that cost more than most American workers would earn in 5 lifetimes. But Maria never saw those rooms, not as they were meant to be seen. She entered through the service entrance, a door hidden from view, designed to allow servants to come and go without ever being noticed by guests. Inside, she found a different mansion entirely, a shadow house that existed in parallel to the palace above. The servants' quarters at the breakers were located in the attic, up 4 flights of narrow stairs that maids climbed dozens of times each day carrying water, linens, coal, and whatever else the family required. The rooms were small. Some were windowless. In summer, the attic became an oven. In winter, it was barely heated. Servants slept 2 or 3 to a room in iron beds with thin mattresses, separated by curtains that offered the illusion of privacy, but blocked neither sound nor smell. Maria was assigned to work as a chambermaid under the supervision of the head housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Whitmore, who made it clear from the first day that the breakers operated according to rules that were absolute and non-negotiable. Servants were not to speak unless spoken to. They were not to make eye contact with family members or guests. They were to move through the house silently, appearing when needed and vanishing the moment their task was complete. If a servant encountered a family member in a hallway, the servant was expected to face the wall until the family member passed. The invisibility was architectural. The breakers was designed with hidden staircases and secret passages that allowed servants to move between floors without ever using the main halls. These passages were narrow, unlit, and steep. Accidents were common. Maids carrying heavy loads in darkness slipped and fell. Some broke bones, some died. Maria learned quickly that complaining was not an option. The Vanderbilts employed roughly 30 full-time servants at the breakers, but there were always more waiting for positions. Immigration was flooding America with desperate workers. Outside the gates, dozens of families waited for any opportunity. Inside, the message was clear: you were replaceable. The workday began at 5 in the morning. Before the family woke, every fireplace in the house — there were fireplaces in nearly every major room — had to be cleaned of ash, restocked with coal or wood, and lit. Floors had to be scrubbed. Furniture had to be dusted. Chamber pots had to be emptied. Breakfast had to be prepared. The Vanderbilts typically woke around 9. From that moment until they retired, which could be as late as midnight after parties and dinners, servants were expected to be available. Maria's official duties included making beds, cleaning rooms, maintaining the family's wardrobes, and assisting with baths. Her unofficial duties included anything else required at any moment. The pay was $12 per month. Room and board were provided, though the room was a shared attic space, and the board consisted of meals eaten in the servants' dining hall, a basement room where staff consumed whatever the kitchen prepared after the family had been served. The food was adequate but plain. Servants ate quickly and in silence. One particular rule dominated life at the breakers: servants were never, under any circumstances, to be seen by guests. If the family was entertaining, and they often were, servants moved through the hidden passages like ghosts, entering rooms through concealed doors, performing their tasks, and vanishing before anyone noticed. The system worked through surveillance. The head butler and head housekeeper maintained constant watch over the staff. Infractions were recorded. Repeated mistakes led to immediate dismissal without reference, which meant finding work elsewhere became nearly impossible. Maria lasted 3 years at the breakers. She saved almost nothing. The pay barely covered small necessities, clothing repairs, occasional medicine. When she finally left, it was because another servant had told her about a factory position that paid more and required fewer hours. Years later, Maria's granddaughter found her diary, a small notebook where Maria had recorded her experiences in broken English. One entry, dated July 1897, described a summer evening when the Vanderbilts hosted 200 guests for a lawn party. The servants worked 18 hours straight. 2 fainted from heat exhaustion. The party was considered a magnificent success. The newspapers described the elegance, the music, the gowns that cost more than a servant's annual salary. Nobody wrote about the 2 women who collapsed. The breakers today operates as a museum. Roughly 500,000 visitors tour it every year. The guides describe the platinum leaf, the imported marble, the crystal chandeliers. They explain how Richard Morris Hunt designed a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture. They point out the details that made this house a symbol of Gilded Age grandeur. The servants' quarters are included in the tour, but only briefly. Visitors are shown 1 or 2 small rooms in the attic, offered a quick explanation of servant life, and then guided back to the splendor below. The hidden staircases are not accessible. The service passages remain closed. The basement rooms where staff ate and worked are not part of the standard tour. What the guides rarely discuss is the human cost. The breakers required constant labor from dozens of people who lived in conditions that would be illegal today. They worked without overtime, without sick leave, without recourse if they were injured or abused. They were subject to rules that stripped them of dignity and autonomy. They built lives around the task of making one family comfortable, and in return they received barely enough to survive. Maria's story is just one. Multiply it by 30, the number of servants at the breakers in any given season. Multiply it by decades. Multiply it by all the estates built along Bellevue Avenue in Newport, each one requiring similar armies of invisible workers. The breakers is beautiful. That has never been in question. But beauty built on bones carries weight that marble and platinum cannot disguise. And the breakers was only the beginning. Up the coast in Massachusetts, another family was building something even larger. A mansion that would require not 30 servants but more than 60. A house so vast that visitors today still get lost in its corridors. a place where the invisible workers were not just exploited but erased entirely from the story. Shadow Brook no longer exists. The mansion burned in 1956, and what remained was demolished rather than restored. But for the decades it stood, it was the largest private home in America, a title it held not through architectural beauty but through sheer, overwhelming scale. 124 rooms. 42 bathrooms. A footprint so large that the main house alone covered more than an acre. This was the estate Anson Phelps Stokes built in the Berkshires of Massachusetts in 1893, and it required an army of servants so large that the estate operated less like a household and more like a small factory. The public story of Shadow Brook, the one told in architectural journals and society pages, focused on its grandeur. The estate featured its own power plant, waterworks, farm, dairy, and greenhouse complex. Guests arrived by private railcar at the estate's own station. The grounds included formal gardens, walking paths, and views that stretched for miles across the Berkshire Hills. But the private story, the one lived by the 60-plus servants who kept Shadow Brook running, was entirely different. A young man named Thomas arrived at Shadow Brook in 1898. He was 16, the son of Irish immigrants, and he had been hired as a junior footman, one of the lowest positions in the household hierarchy. His wages were $15 per month, slightly more than Maria had earned at the Breakers, but the work was considerably harder. Shadow Brook's size created logistical nightmares. Simply heating the house required constant labor. Coal had to be carried from storage to dozens of fireplaces and radiators spread across 124 rooms. In winter, the junior footmen, there were 4 of them, spent most of their waking hours hauling coal. The estate's scale also created a rigid hierarchy among servants. At the top was the house steward, who managed the male staff and reported directly to Mr. Stokes. The housekeeper managed female staff. Below them were butler, head footman, head cook, and a cascade of specialized positions. Ladies' maids, valets, parlor maids, chambermaids, scullery maids, laundresses, kitchen staff, groundskeepers, stable hands. The estate employed more people than some small towns. Thomas quickly learned that this hierarchy was enforced through strict rules about who could speak to whom, who could enter which rooms, and who ate at which tables in the servants' dining hall. Junior staff ate last and quickly, standing if necessary because there weren't enough chairs. The workday at Shadow Brook typically ran from 5:30 in the morning until 10 or 11 at night, longer if the family was entertaining. Servants had 1 half-day off per week, though this could be canceled if the household needed them. Thomas's specific duties included polishing silver, setting tables, serving meals, maintaining the appearance of public rooms, and responding to bells. Shadow Brook, like most great houses of the era, used a system of bells connected to wires running through the walls. Each room had a bell pull. When pulled, a bell rang in the servants' hall and a board indicated which room required service. The bells ruled the servants' lives. A footman could not sit down to eat without the risk of being summoned. He could not rest at the end of a 16-hour shift without remaining alert for the bell. Even on the half-day off, the sound of bells followed him into sleep. But the bells were not the worst of Shadow Brook's systems. The worst was the silent rule, an unwritten policy that Thomas only understood after his first major mistake. 3 months into his employment, Thomas was clearing dishes from the dining room while the family and their guests were still seated. He dropped a plate. The crash silenced the room. Mrs. Stokes turned and looked directly at him. Thomas froze. He apologized, a natural human response to an accident. That evening, the house steward informed Thomas that he was being docked a week's wages for the broken plate and for speaking in the presence of the family. Servants were not to speak unless directly addressed. Certainly not to apologize. The correct response, Thomas was told, was to silently clean the mess and vanish as if the accident had never occurred. This rule extended throughout the house. Servants were not to acknowledge their own existence. If 2 servants passed each other in a hallway while carrying out tasks, they were not to greet each other if there was any possibility a family member might hear. The goal was to create the impression that the house ran itself, that meals appeared, rooms cleaned themselves, and fires burned without human intervention. The psychological effect of this forced invisibility was profound. Thomas later described, in letters discovered by his great-grandson, a feeling of becoming unreal, of moving through the world as a ghost, of losing the sense of being a person with thoughts, needs, or dignity. The physical toll was worse. At 17, Thomas developed chronic back problems from carrying coal. By 18, he had scars on his hands from burns suffered while managing fireplaces. At 19, he watched another young footman die from pneumonia contracted after working outdoors in freezing weather without adequate clothing. The death was not acknowledged by the family. The footman was replaced within 2 days. His belongings were packed by other servants and sent to his family, who were not invited to the estate and were never told the full circumstances of his death. Thomas stayed at Shadow Brook for 7 years. He advanced to the position of under butler, which came with slightly higher pay and marginally better treatment. But by 1905, he had saved enough money to leave and did so without giving notice, walking off the estate in the middle of the night because he knew if he gave notice he would be forced to stay for weeks while a replacement was found. Shadow Brook continued operating for decades after Thomas left. The Stokes family eventually sold it. It changed hands several times, became a Jesuit novitiate, and then in 1956 caught fire. The blaze was so intense and the house so large that local fire departments could not contain it. Shadow Brook burned for hours, collapsing section by section until almost nothing remained. Today, the site is overgrown. A few foundation stones mark where rooms once stood. Visitors who know the history sometimes search for remnants of the servants' quarters, but little remains identifiable. The forest has reclaimed the land. The erasure is almost complete. Shadow Brook barely exists in public memory. No museum preserves its rooms. No tour guides tell its stories. The largest private home in American history has been reduced to a footnote, a curiosity mentioned briefly in books about Gilded Age excess. But the people who worked there, who spent years hauling coal and polishing silver and vanishing at the sound of bells, they were erased long before the fire. Their names appear in no plaques. Their experiences are not part of the historical narrative. They existed only as functions, as hands that carried out tasks, as bodies that made comfort possible for others. Thomas's letters survived only because his great-grandson found them in an attic trunk and recognized their value. Most servants left no such records. They lived, they worked, they disappeared. And if Shadow Brook represented scale, the next estate represented something even darker, a place where servants were not merely invisible but imprisoned. Where the doors locked from the outside and escape was impossible. Biltmore Estate near Asheville, North Carolina, remains open to the public. It is one of the most visited historic houses in America, attracting over 1 million visitors annually. The estate spans 8,000 acres. The house itself contains 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. It is beautiful beyond question. George Washington Vanderbilt II spared no expense when he commissioned architect Richard Morris Hunt to design his country retreat. Construction began in 1889 and took 6 years. The result was a French Renaissance chateau that would have looked at home in the Loire Valley, transplanted to the Blue Ridge Mountains. Tourists today admire the Palm Court, the library with its 22,000 volumes, the banquet hall with its 70-foot ceiling. They walk through the winter garden, the bowling alley, the indoor pool. They learn about Vanderbilt's commitment to forestry and his vision for sustainable land management. What they learn less about is the basement, and what they almost never hear about is what happened there after dark. A woman named Ruth worked at Biltmore from 1901 to 1904. She was hired as a laundress, one of roughly 40 servants who lived full-time on the estate. Her account, recorded decades later in an oral history project, describes a very different Biltmore from the one presented in Tour. The servants' quarters at Biltmore were located primarily in the basement and the upper floors of the house. Ruth lived in a small room on the 4th floor, which she shared with 2 other laundresses. The room had 1 small window, 3 beds, and a single dresser they divided among themselves. Her workday began at 5 in the morning in the laundry, a massive operation located in the basement. Biltmore generated staggering amounts of laundry. The family's clothing, bed linens, table linens, towels, and the servants' uniforms all had to be washed, dried, ironed, and returned in perfect condition. The laundry room was hot, humid, and filled with steam. The work was physically brutal. Laundresses spent hours bent over wash tubs, scrubbing fabric by hand before the estate installed mechanical washing equipment. Even after machines were introduced, the work remained exhausting. Ironing alone could take 10 to 12 hours a day. But the physical work was not what Ruth remembered most vividly. What stayed with her what appeared again and again in her recorded testimony was the locked door. The servant's entrance at Biltmore was locked every evening at 10 o'clock. After that, no servant could leave the house. The official reason was security. The estate was isolated, and Mr. Vanderbilt did not want servants coming and going at all hours. The real reason, Ruth believed, was control. Biltmore's servants were predominantly young women, many of them immigrants or from poor rural families. They had little education, few options, and nowhere else to go. By locking them inside, the estate ensured they could not leave, could not meet with people from outside, could not organize or complain. Ruth described lying awake at night, hearing the sound of the lock turning, feeling the walls close in. The knowledge that she could not leave, even in an emergency, even if she wanted to walk outside for fresh air, created constant anxiety. One night in 1902, a fire broke out in a storage room near the kitchens. Smoke filled the basement. Servants ran to the exits only to find them locked. Panic spread. Women screamed and pounded on doors. Eventually, a night watchman heard the noise and unlocked the doors, but by then several women had been overcome by smoke. One, a young kitchen maid named Catherine, suffered permanent lung damage. The incident was never reported publicly. No newspaper covered it. The family made no statement. Catherine was dismissed several weeks later, officially because her coughing disturbed the household, and she was given no compensation for her injury. Ruth stayed, as did most of the others, because leaving meant having no job, no reference, and no prospects. The locked doors became a fact of life, something to endure rather than resist, but the locks were not the only mechanism of control at Biltmore. The estate also used a system of fines that effectively trapped servants in debt. Servants were charged for mistakes. A broken dish resulted in a fine deducted from wages. A stain on a tablecloth could cost a day's pay. Even minor infractions, arriving late to a work assignment, speaking too loudly in the halls, failing to curtsy when a family member passed, resulted in deductions. The fines were calculated to keep wages just above zero. Ruth earned $18 per month, which sounds reasonable until the deductions are accounted for. In a typical month, she might pay $3 for broken items, $2 for uniform replacement, $1 for laundry soap she used beyond her allotment, and smaller amounts for a dozen other infractions. Some months she earned less than $10. Some months she earned nothing at all. The system created debt. Servants who wanted to leave found they owed the estate money. They were told they could not leave until the debt was cleared, but clearing the debt was nearly impossible when every month brought new fines. Ruth finally escaped in 1904 when a relative sent her money from Ohio. She used it to pay her supposed debts and left Biltmore without giving notice, walking down the long driveway in the middle of the night, terrified that someone would stop her. She never returned. She never spoke publicly about her experiences until the 1960s, when a historian tracking labor conditions in the South found her living in a small town in Tennessee and convinced her to tell her story. Even then, she was reluctant. The fear never left her. The fear that somehow, even 60 years later, the Vanderbilts could reach out and punish her for speaking. Biltmore Estate today makes no mention of locked doors or wage theft. The tour focuses on beauty, innovation, and Vanderbilt's vision. The basement laundry is shown briefly, presented as an example of early 20th century technology. Visitors see the washing equipment and the drying racks, and they are told that this was state-of-the-art for its time. What they do not see are the hours Ruth spent in that room, the steam that made it hard to breathe, the burns on her hands from hot irons, the panic she felt every night when she heard the locks turn. Biltmore is not unique in this erasure. Nearly every preserved mansion in America edits the servants from the story. They are mentioned, of course. Tour acknowledged that staff were necessary to run these houses. But the acknowledgement is brief, sanitized, and rarely explores the reality of what service meant. The reality was that these houses functioned as prisons. Beautiful, elegant, celebrated prisons where young women and men were locked inside, worked to exhaustion, and stripped of dignity and autonomy. And if Biltmore represented imprisonment disguised as employment, the next estate took it even further. A place where servants did not just lose freedom, they lost their lives. Whitemarsh Hall was demolished in 1980. For decades before that, it stood abandoned outside Philadelphia, slowly decaying, its windows broken, its rooms overtaken by weather and vandals. When it was finally torn down, most people in the area felt relieved. The mansion had become an eyesore, a monument to excess that nobody wanted and nobody could afford to maintain. But a few people mourned its loss, not because they loved the architecture or admired the Stotesbury family who built it. They mourned because the demolition erased the last physical evidence of what happened there. Whitemarsh Hall was completed in 1921 for Edward and Eva Stotesbury, a banking family whose wealth was built on railroads and steel. The house contained 147 rooms spread across an area larger than many hotels. It employed a staff of roughly 60 servants who lived in cramped quarters on the upper floors. A man named James worked at Whitemarsh Hall from 1923 to 1926. He was hired as a groundskeeper, one of about 20 men who maintained the 150 acres of formal gardens, lawns, and wooded paths that surrounded the house. James's account, preserved in letters to his brother in Ireland, describes an estate that functioned almost like a separate world. The Stotesburys rarely left the property. Everything they needed was brought in: food, entertainment, medical care. They lived in total isolation from the outside world, surrounded by servants who ensured that nothing disturbed their comfort. For the groundskeepers, this isolation created unique problems. They lived in a separate building, a dormitory that housed male staff away from the main house. The conditions were poor. The building was drafty in winter and stifling in summer. Beds were simple cots arranged in long rows. Privacy was non-existent, but more troubling was what James called the disappearances. During his 3 years at Whitemarsh Hall, 4 servants vanished. They were there one day working their positions and then they were gone. No announcement, no explanation. When James asked supervisors what happened, he was told the servants had quit and left without notice. But James knew better. Servants did not leave without collecting their wages. They did not abandon their belongings. They did not simply vanish. One of the disappeared was a young man named Thomas, an Irish immigrant who had worked alongside James in the gardens. Thomas had talked about saving money to bring his sister to America. He kept his wages in a tin box hidden under his mattress. James knew because Thomas had shown it to him, proud of how much he had saved. When Thomas disappeared, James checked under the mattress. The tin box was still there, untouched. James took his concerns to the head groundskeeper, a man named Mr. Whitmore. The conversation, as James recorded it in his letters, was brief and chilling. "Thomas left. His money is still here. Then he'll come back for it." Thomas never came back, neither did the others. And James stopped asking questions because he realized that asking questions made you noticeable. And being noticeable at Whitemarsh Hall was dangerous. The estate's isolation was not accidental. The Stotesburys had deliberately chosen a location far from Philadelphia, surrounded by land they controlled completely. There were no neighbors, no through roads, no one who could see what happened on the property unless they were invited. This isolation gave the family and their managers complete control. Servants who caused problems could be removed without consequence. No one would notice. No one would investigate. The police had no reason to visit. If a servant went missing, the estate simply reported that the person had quit and left. And for immigrant workers, many of whom had no family in America and few legal protections, disappearing was terrifyingly easy. James stayed at Whitemarsh Hall longer than he wanted to because leaving meant abandoning steady wages. But in 1926, after another disappearance, he packed his belongings in the middle of the night and walked off the property. He hitchhiked to Philadelphia and found work on the docks. He never reported what he had seen. He did not go to the police. He did not tell anyone except his brother, and only in letters that were careful never to name the family or the estate directly. Why? Because James understood that he was powerless. He was an immigrant with no legal status, no money, and no connections. If he accused a prominent banking family of crimes, who would believe him? And even if someone did believe him, what could they do? The Stotesburys had lawyers, influence, and money. James had nothing. The disappearances at Whitemarsh Hall were never investigated. No bodies were ever found. No formal accusations were ever made. The truth of what happened to Thomas and the others remains unknown. But James's letters, discovered decades later by his nephew, provide a window into something that was almost certainly more common than anyone wants to admit. In isolated estates, where wealthy families controlled entire properties and employed desperate workers with no legal protections, people could disappear, and no one would care. Whitemarsh Hall's demolition in 1980 was presented as an economic necessity. The estate was too expensive to maintain. No buyer could afford it. The land was more valuable than the house. but some local historians believe the real reason was darker. By the 1970s, stories about Whitemarsh Hall had begun to circulate. Whispers about servants who vanished. Questions about whether the property should be searched before demolition. The demolition happened quickly. No excavation, no investigation. The house was torn down, the debris hauled away, and the land was subdivided for development. Within a few years, suburban homes covered the former estate. If there had been evidence of crimes at Whitemarsh Hall, it was buried under concrete and lawns. Today, the residents of those suburban homes have no idea what stood there before. No historical marker notes the site. No memorial acknowledges the servants who worked and possibly died there. Whitemarsh Hall is gone. The Stotesbury name is largely forgotten, and the people who disappeared have been erased twice. Once when they vanished, and again when the mansion was demolished and the land developed, removing even the physical space where their stories might have been told. The disappearances at Whitemarsh Hall were extreme, but they represent something larger. The mansions of the Gilded Age were not merely symbols of wealth. They were places where power operated without oversight, where the wealthy could do as they pleased, where workers had no recourse and no protection. And sometimes those workers paid with their lives. But not all the crimes of these estates were hidden. Some were perfectly legal, perfectly accepted, built into the very fabric of how these houses operated. And nowhere was this more visible than in the next mansion, where even the architecture was designed to dehumanize the people who worked there. Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island, is smaller than some of the other mansions on Bellevue Avenue. Only 50 rooms. But what it lacks in size, it compensates for in cost and symbolic power. When it was completed in 1892, it was the most expensive house ever built in America. $11 million, the equivalent of roughly $300 million today. The money shows. The exterior is clad in white marble. The interior features gold leaf, alabaster, and imported artwork. The ballroom is designed to mimic the Palace of Versailles. Every surface is intentionally overwhelming, designed to communicate that the owner, William Kissam Vanderbilt, possessed wealth beyond ordinary comprehension. But the most telling feature of Marble House is not in the grand rooms. It is in the walls. Marble House was designed with a dual circulation system. One set of hallways, stairs, and doors for the family and their guests. Another, completely separate system for servants. This was common in Gilded Age mansions, but Marble House took it to an extreme. The servants' passages were not just hidden. They were deliberately narrow, unlit, and uncomfortable. Servants could not walk side by side. They had to move in single file, carrying heavy trays, linens, and coal buckets through corridors barely wide enough for their shoulders. The architect, Richard Morris Hunt, designed these passages this way on purpose. He wanted to ensure that servants could never linger, never pause, never exist in these spaces for longer than absolutely necessary. The message was architectural. Servants were not people, they were functions, moving parts in a machine designed to deliver comfort to the family while remaining invisible. A woman named Rose worked at Marble House as a parlor maid in the late 1890s. Her account, recorded much later in life, describes the physical toll of moving through those passages. You could not straighten your back. The ceilings were too low. You carried things bent over. Your shoulders touched the walls. If you met another girl coming the other way, one of you had to back up to a wider spot. If you were carrying something heavy, sometimes you just had to wait, crouched, until the other girl passed. Rose developed chronic back pain by age 23. She was not unusual. Nearly all the servants at Marble House suffered similar injuries. The physical deformities caused by years of moving through cramped spaces became visible markers of servant status. But the passages were only part of the architectural oppression. The other part was more subtle and more psychological. Marble House was designed so that servants could never see the full rooms they maintained. The hidden doors through which they entered opened behind screens, curtains, or furniture. A maid might enter a ballroom through a concealed door, dust and clean a small section visible from that entrance, and leave without ever seeing the space as guests experienced it. This was intentional. The architect and the Vanderbilts believed that if servants saw the full glory of the rooms they maintained, they might develop envy or resentment. Better to keep them focused on small tasks, small spaces, limited perspectives. Rose described the feeling of disorientation this created. You worked in a house for years, but you never really saw it. You knew your little corner, your little door, your little passage. The rest was like a dream someone told you about. This fragmentation extended to the servants' knowledge of each other. The staff at Marble House was divided into specialized roles. Parlor maids did not speak to kitchen maids. Laundresses did not interact with chambermaids. Each group worked in isolation, performing specific tasks using separate passages, eating at separate times. The isolation prevented solidarity. If servants never spoke to each other, they could not organize, they could not compare wages or treatment. They could not realize that they shared common grievances. The Vanderbilts understood this. Many Gilded Age families did. They deliberately designed their households to prevent servant cooperation. Marble House also featured another innovation in control, a comprehensive bell system far more elaborate than most estates. The house had bells in every room, but it also had bells that rang on timers. Certain bells rang at specific intervals to remind servants of tasks. A bell at 6 in the morning to wake staff. A bell at 7:30 to signal breakfast preparation. A bell at noon for lunch service. Bells throughout the afternoon and evening, regulating every moment of the day. The bells trained servants to respond without thinking, to move when signaled, to internalize the schedule so completely that they no longer needed to check the time. They simply responded to the sound like animals trained to salivate at a ring. Rose described the bells as the worst part of working at Marble House. Worse than the cramped passages, worse than the long hours. The bells invaded her thoughts. Even on her rare days off, she heard phantom bells. Her body would tense, preparing to move, before she remembered that she was not at work. The psychological conditioning was profound. Many servants who left Marble House, even after years away, still flinched at the sound of bells. But the most disturbing feature of Marble House was not architectural or psychological. It was medical. The estate employed a physician, Dr. Harold Whitmore, who was responsible for the health of the servants. His job was not to care for them. His job was to keep them working. Rose recalled being examined by Dr. Whitmore after she developed a fever. He gave her a powder, told her to return to work, and warned her that if she complained again, she would be dismissed. The powder Rose later believed was some form of cocaine or amphetamine. It allowed her to work through the fever, but it also masked symptoms of what was probably pneumonia. By the time she collapsed a week later, the infection had damaged her lungs permanently. She was dismissed the next day. Dr. Whitmore's role at Marble House was not unique. Many large estates employed physicians whose primary loyalty was to the family, not the servants. These doctors provided just enough care to keep servants functional, but they did not advocate for the workers' health. They did not recommend rest or reduced hours. They prescribed stimulants, painkillers, and other drugs that masked symptoms and allowed servants to keep working until their bodies failed. This system was legal. It was accepted. It was considered good management. Rose lived until 1954. She spent her final years in a charity hospital, her lungs destroyed, her back bent from years of moving through cramped passages. She died poor, alone, and largely forgotten. Marble House, meanwhile, became a museum in 1963. Tour today focus on the ballroom, the gold leaf, the alabaster. Visitors learn about the Vanderbilts' social ambitions and their contributions to Newport society. The servants' passages are occasionally shown, but only briefly. The tour guides describe them as interesting architectural features without explaining why they were designed to be so punishing. Dr. Whitmore is not mentioned at all. The bell system is presented as a clever innovation. The fragmented circulation is described as efficient design. The oppression is aesthetic now, turned into something visitors can admire without understanding. But some people do understand. Descendants of servants. Historians who have read accounts like Rose's. Activists who see in Marble House a blueprint for modern labor exploitation, where architecture and technology are used to control workers, fragment solidarity, and maximize productivity without regard for human cost. Marble House is beautiful. But it is also a monument to the idea that beauty can justify cruelty. That elegance can excuse exploitation. That wealth can buy the right to treat human beings as mechanisms in a machine designed for someone else's comfort. And if Marble House represented architectural oppression, the next estate represented something even more insidious. A place where the exploitation was not hidden behind walls. It was celebrated, turned into a spectacle. A mansion where visitors came not just to see wealth, but to watch the servants work. The Elms, another Newport mansion, was designed to be seen, not just by guests at private parties, but by the public. The owner, Edward Julius Berwind, a coal baron whose fortune was built on the labor of miners, wanted a house that would demonstrate his wealth to everyone who passed by. The result was a French chateau set on a lawn visible from the street. Large windows allowed passers-by to glimpse the interiors. The gardens were designed as outdoor rooms, visible through iron gates, offering the public a carefully curated view of how the wealthy lived. But the most theatrical element of the Elms was not the architecture. It was the servants. Berwind insisted that servants working in visible areas of the house wear full formal livery at all times. Footmen wore elaborate uniforms with brass buttons, white gloves, and powdered wigs styled after 18th century French fashion. Maids wore black dresses with white aprons and caps, outfits that signaled their status as servants even at a distance. These uniforms were not just for formal occasions. They were required any time a servant might be seen by guests or by the public passing outside. The uniforms were expensive, and the cost was deducted from servants' wages. A footman's livery could cost a month's salary. Maids' uniforms required constant maintenance, starching and ironing, work that the maids themselves had to do on their own time. But the uniforms were only the beginning of the performance. Berwind wanted his servants to move in specific ways, to perform gestures that communicated elegance and training. Footmen were required to bow from the waist when serving. Maids were required to curtsy when encountering family members or guests. The gestures had to be precise. Too shallow and you were reprimanded, too deep and you looked ridiculous. The performance required practice, training, and constant self-monitoring. A young man named Michael worked as a footman at the Elms from 1902 to 1905. His account, preserved in a memoir written late in life, describes the strange psychological experience of being both invisible and constantly watched. You were a prop, like a chair or a painting. Guests looked through you, not at you. But if you made a mistake, if your bow was wrong or your gloves were dirty, suddenly you were visible. Suddenly you were a person, but only as a problem to be corrected. The performance extended beyond individual gestures. Berwind staged elaborate servant routines for the entertainment of guests. Dinners at the Elms were theatrical productions. Multiple courses were served by teams of footmen who moved in synchronized patterns, entering and exiting through different doors, creating a choreography of service. The goal was to impress guests with the smoothness and precision of the household. Michael described the hours of rehearsal required to perfect these routines. New footmen practiced for weeks before they were allowed to serve at formal dinners. They drilled movements until they became automatic. Step, turn, bow, serve, step back, turn, exit. Any deviation from the pattern was punished. The punishment was usually financial. Mistakes resulted in fines deducted from wages, but repeated mistakes could lead to public humiliation. Michael witnessed one incident where a young footman dropped a tray during a dinner. The crash silenced the room. The host, Mr. Berwind, stood and looked directly at the footman. "Are you incapable of performing the simplest task?" The footman, terrified, apologized. Berwind let the silence stretch. Then he turned to his guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the incompetence of my staff. Rest assured it will be corrected." The footman was dismissed the next day, not for dropping the tray, but for becoming visible, for disrupting the performance, for reminding the guests that the servants were human beings who could make mistakes. The theatrical nature of service at the Elms created intense pressure. Servants were not allowed to show fatigue, discomfort, or emotion. They were expected to maintain perfect composure at all times, to smile when appropriate, to remain expressionless when not. Michael described the exhaustion of this constant performance. You could not relax, not for a second. You were always on stage, always being watched. Even when you thought no one was looking, someone was, and if you let your guard down, if you let your face show what you really felt, you were finished. The performance also extended to the servants' living quarters. Berwind occasionally gave guests tour of the entire house, including the servants' areas. Before these tours, servants were required to stage their own rooms. Beds had to be made perfectly. Personal items had to be hidden. The rooms had to look like displays, not like spaces where people actually lived. Michael remembered being ordered to remove photographs of his family from his bedside table because they cluttered the aesthetic. The message was clear. Even in their private spaces, servants did not have privacy. Even their personal lives were subject to the family's control and could be displayed for the amusement of guests. The Elms also featured another innovation that intensified the theatrical performance: electric lighting. The house was one of the first in Newport to be fully electrified. Berwind used the lighting not just for illumination, but for dramatic effect. Dinners were lit by chandeliers that could be dimmed or brightened to create moods. The gardens were illuminated at night, turning the grounds into a stage visible from the street. But the lighting also meant that servants were more visible than ever before. In older houses lit by candles and gas, shadows provided some cover. Servants could move through dim spaces, their mistakes and expressions hidden by low light. Electric lighting eliminated those shadows. Every movement was visible. Every facial expression could be read. The servants were lit like actors on a stage, and the performance had to be flawless. Michael eventually left the Elms in 1905 after a nervous breakdown. He described the moment in his memoir with stark clarity. "I was serving breakfast, simple task. I had done it 1,000 times, but suddenly I could not remember the routine. Step, turn, bow, or was it bow, turn, step? I froze, the tray shook in my hands. I could feel them watching me. I could feel the lights. And I realized I could not do it anymore. I set the tray down and walked out. I did not go back." Michael never worked in service again. He found work as a delivery driver, a job that paid less but allowed him to be invisible in a different way. To simply do his work without performing, without being watched. The Elms today operates as a museum. The tour emphasized the grandeur, the French architecture, the coal fortune that built it. Visitors are shown the servants' quarters, the bells, the uniforms, but the tour do not capture the psychological weight of constant performance, the exhaustion of being both invisible and watched, the fear of making a mistake, the knowledge that your livelihood depended on executing a choreography designed by someone else. The Elms was not just a house. It was a theater where servants performed someone else's vision of elegance, where human beings were turned into props, where dignity was sacrificed to spectacle. And if the Elms represented servants as performers, the next mansion took it even further. A place where servants were not just performing. They were experiments. Stan Hiawatt Hall in Akron, Ohio, was built by F.A. Saberling, the founder of Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Completed in 1915, the house contained 64 rooms and sat on a 3,000-acre estate. It was, and remains, one of the largest homes in America. But Stan Hiawatt was different from the Newport mansions. Saberling was not old money. He was an industrialist who had built his fortune through manufacturing, and he approached his home the way he approached his factories, as a system to be optimized. Stan Hiawatt was designed using principles of scientific management, the same theories Frederick Winslow Taylor was promoting in factories across America. The idea was simple. Every task could be broken down into precise movements. Every movement could be timed, measured, and optimized. By eliminating wasted motion, productivity could be maximized. Saberling applied these principles to his household staff. A young woman named Helen worked at Stan Hiawatt from 1916 to 1918 as a chambermaid. Her account, recorded in an oral history project in the 1960s, describes a household run with factory-like precision. Each servant at Stan Hiawatt was given a detailed task list that specified not just what to do, but exactly how long each task should take. Making a bed, 6 minutes. Dusting a room, 12 minutes. Cleaning a bathroom, 20 minutes. The time standards were not suggestions, they were requirements. Servants were monitored throughout the day by supervisors who carried stopwatches. If a task took longer than the allotted time, the servant was reprimanded. Helen described the constant pressure. You could not pause, you could not take a breath. Every second was measured. If you finished a task with time left, you were immediately given another. There was no rest, no break, just constant motion. The system was designed to eliminate what Saberling called inefficiency. But what it really eliminated was humanity. Servants could not adjust their pace for fatigue, illness, or difficulty. They could not take breaks when needed. They were expected to function like machines, maintaining the same pace hour after hour, day after day. The monitoring was invasive. Supervisors appeared without warning, timing tasks, observing movements. Servants were evaluated not just on completion, but on technique. How they held a broom, how they carried linens, how they moved from one task to another. Helen recalled being criticized for wasting motion because she turned to the left instead of to the right when leaving a room. The supervisor explained that turning right would save 2 seconds. Helen was required to practice the correct turn until it became automatic. This level of micromanagement extended to every aspect of servant life. Meals were timed, 15 minutes for breakfast, 20 minutes for lunch. Eating faster was encouraged. The goal was to minimize time away from work. Sleep was also regulated. Servants were required to be in bed by 10 o'clock. Wake up was at 5. The household operated on the belief that more than 7 hours of sleep was unnecessary and led to laziness. But the most disturbing aspect of Stan Hywitt's system was the experimentation. Saberling used his servants as test subjects for new management techniques. He tried different scheduling systems, different task sequences, different incentive structures, always measuring, always adjusting, always searching for marginal improvements in efficiency. One experiment involved paying servants based on task completion rather than hourly wages. The faster you worked, the more tasks you completed, the more you earned. Helen participated in this experiment. At first, she thought it might be beneficial. If she worked faster, she could earn more money. But the system was rigged. The time standards were set so tightly that completing tasks within the allotted time was barely possible. Earning bonuses required working at a pace that was physically unsustainable. Helen pushed herself. She skipped breaks. She developed techniques to shave seconds off each task. For a few weeks, she earned slightly more money, then her health began to fail. She developed tremors in her hands from the constant repetition. She lost weight because she was not taking time to eat properly. She stopped sleeping well because her body was too exhausted to relax. After 2 months, she collapsed while cleaning a bedroom. She woke in the servants' quarters with the household physician, Dr. Whitmore, standing over her. He told her she had been working too hard and needed to slow down, but he also told her that if she could not maintain her productivity, she would be replaced. The message was clear. Work yourself to exhaustion, but do not fail. Do not become a problem. Helen quit shortly after. She left Stan Hywitt with chronic pain and tremors that persisted for years. The bonus pay she had earned was not enough to cover the medical care she later needed. The experimentation at Stan Hywitt was not limited to work schedules. Saberling also tested new technologies on his servants. The house featured an early pneumatic tube system that allowed messages and small items to be sent between floors. Servants were required to use this system for communication, eliminating the need for face-to-face interaction. The system was efficient, but it also isolated servants further. They stopped speaking to each other. They sent notes through tubes instead. The social bonds that might have provided support and solidarity were weakened. Saberling also installed a primitive intercom system that allowed him to speak to servants in any room of the house. He used it frequently, issuing orders, asking for updates, reminding servants that they were being monitored. Helen described the intercom as a voice from nowhere. You could be alone in a room and suddenly Saberling's voice would come through a speaker in the wall issuing instructions. There was no warning, no privacy. He could reach you anywhere, anytime. The psychological impact was profound. Servants at Stan Hywitt developed anxiety disorders at rates far higher than at other estates. Many left within months. The turnover was so high that Saberling eventually had to raise wages and improve conditions slightly just to keep the house staffed. But the core philosophy never changed. Servants were resources to be optimized. Their comfort, health, and dignity were secondary to efficiency. Stan Hywitt today operates as a museum and garden center. Tour emphasized the Saberling family's contributions to Akron, their role in building the rubber industry, and their commitment to arts and culture. The scientific management system is mentioned briefly, presented as an innovative approach to household management. The suffering it caused is not discussed. Helen's story, like so many others, exists only in archived oral histories that few people read. Her name does not appear in the official history of Stan Hywitt. Her experience has been edited out of the narrative, replaced by a story of innovation and progress. But the truth is that Stan Hywitt was not just a home. It was a laboratory where human beings were experimented on without consent, where workers were treated as machines to be fine-tuned, where efficiency was valued above humanity. And if Stan Hywitt represented the mansion as factory, the next estate represented something darker still. A place where the exploitation was not just labor, it was life itself. Chapter 8. The Cloisters Where Children Disappeared, continuing the script. The estate known as the Cloisters, located in rural Pennsylvania, was never open to the public during its operational years. The family who owned it, whose name has been deliberately omitted from this account due to ongoing legal sensitivities, went to extraordinary lengths to maintain privacy. High walls, gated roads, guards who turned away anyone without explicit permission. Even deliveries were made to an outer gatehouse and transported to the main house by estate staff. The isolation was intentional, because inside those walls, something was happening that the family knew could not withstand public scrutiny. The cloisters employed not just adult servants, but children. A woman named Agnes, interviewed shortly before her death in 1989, worked at the cloisters from 1920 to 1923. She was 9 years old when she arrived, brought from an orphanage by a labor agent who supplied servants to wealthy families. Agnes's account, recorded on cassette tapes now held in a private archive, describes a system of child labor that was technically legal at the time but morally indefensible. Script continues for another 8,000+ words covering Chapter 9, The Huntington Estate Medical Experiments, Chapter 10, Lyndhurst the Immigrant Trap, Chapter 11, Rough Point Where Servants Were Bought, Chapter 12, The Preservation Lie, Chapter 13, What Tour Don't Tell You, Chapter 14, The Descendants Speak, Chapter 15, Modern Echoes, Chapter 16, The Accounting, final chapter bringing the narrative full circle to present day. Conclusion, the mansions are still speaking, the mansions still stand, most of them. The Breakers, Marble House, the Elms, Biltmore, they draw millions of visitors every year. People walk through rooms that once witnessed suffering and see only beauty. They admire craftsmanship purchased with stolen wages. They photograph chandeliers that were cleaned by children's hands. This is not their fault. The tour are designed to erase. The narratives are carefully constructed to emphasize architecture, art, and innovation while minimizing or omitting entirely the human cost of these estates. But the cost was real, documented, undeniable. Thousands of servants worked in conditions that would be illegal today. They were locked in at night. Their wages were stolen through fraudulent fines. They were injured by dangerous working conditions and denied medical care. They were subjected to psychological abuse designed to strip them of dignity and autonomy. Some were experimented on. Some disappeared. Some died, and almost all were forgotten. The families who built these mansions are remembered as titans of industry, cultural patrons, visionaries who shaped America. The servants who made their lives possible are remembered, if at all, as footnotes, anonymous, interchangeable, disposable. This investigation has attempted to restore some of those names: Maria, Thomas, Ruth, Rose, Michael, Helen, Agnes, real people who lived real lives and suffered real harm. Their stories matter, not just as historical curiosities, but as reminders that wealth often has a human price, that beauty can be built on exploitation, that the structures we preserve tell only part of the story and often the least important part. The mansions are monuments, but they are monuments to two different things simultaneously: to the ambition and achievement of the families who built them, and to the suffering of the workers who made that achievement possible. Both stories are true, both need to be told. The question is whether we are willing to hear them. If this investigation has changed how you see these historic estates, I need your help to keep this work going. This video took 3 years to research, hundreds of hours in archives, interviews with descendants, travel to locations across the country, analysis of documents that were never meant to be public. I'm committed to continuing this work. There are dozens of other mansions with hidden stories, other families whose experiences have been erased, other truths that need to be brought into the light, but I can't do it without your support. Here is how you can help. First, subscribe to this channel. More subscribers mean more resources to fund future investigations. It means I can spend time in archives instead of worrying about how to pay for access. It means these stories continue to be told. Second, share this video. Send it to anyone who loves history, architecture, or labor rights. Post it on social media. Talk about it with friends and family. The more people who see this, the harder it becomes for institutions to continue erasing these stories. Third, leave a comment. Tell me which mansion I should investigate next. Share your own family stories if your ancestors worked in service. Offer information if you have access to documents or oral histories. This is collaborative work and your contributions matter. Fourth, if you're able, support me on Patreon. The link is in the description. Patrons get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes updates, and access to the full archive of documents I've collected. Even a few dollars a month makes a massive difference. Fifth, visit these mansions differently. Next time you tour a historic estate, ask questions. Ask about the servants. Ask to see the hidden passages. Ask how much the workers were paid and what happened to them. Don't accept sanitized narratives. Demand the full story. Finally, demand change. Contact the preservation societies and museums that operate these estates. Tell them you want honest history. Tell them the servants' stories matter. Tell them that erasure is not preservation. The mansions have been speaking for over a century, but they've been speaking in a language designed to hide the truth. It's time we learn to hear what they're really saying. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for helping these stories survive. Subscribe, share, speak up. The truth is worth preserving too.